You're all welcome, comrades, to this meeting of Works International Network. Today is a different type of meeting. We're hoping to draw on the rich experience of the comrades here in the labour movement, many years, over many years, and several countries. And we want comrades to examine that experience and the influence of Marxism in the labour movement, not just our experiences in various left-wing groups, that's part of it, but also how to build the influence of Marxism in the movement, and also how to build the movement, how to build mass parties in which Marxism plays a very important role. So we're looking at what lessons we can draw from our own experiences, from our approach, what new approach. We want to distinguish good experiences from bad experience. It's not a counselling session where comrades just talk about their own bad experiences in various movements. We want people to examine their experience with a view to drawing lessons and applying these lessons to the new developing movement. I don't need to explain it here, but the word Marxism is a much abused term. For example, Trump calls his opponents Marxists, no matter who they are, wherever they come from. Russia and China have been described for decades as the kind of fountain of Marxism, and it's done a lot of damage to Marxism and to the image of Marxism. Then you hear casual references to Marxist guerrillas in South America. So the word Marxism is much abused. So we need to go back to the basic principles of Marxism. For example, the labor theory of value, the division of society into classes, historical materialism. So we want to apply these basic ideas using what we would describe as the Marxist method. Now, we can take 1848 as our starting point when the Communist Manifesto was written by Marx and Engels, and that contains a lot of the basic ideas on which the Marxist movement is based. But the key is how to apply that using the correct methods and the correct approach. The experiences that we all have in the movement in terms of small organizations and splits that develop interminably in all of these groups, that's not new. That didn't happen in the 60s and 70s. That goes right back. For example, Marx himself was a member of a small group called the League of the Just, which is largely just German workers, former German workers living in England. When he and Engels joined that small group, they then changed the name to the League of Communists. But then, nonetheless, from that small group, we got the First International and the development of a whole range of ideas across the movement, particularly in Europe, but also in America. And then we had Lenin living in London, belonging to a small group called the Emancipation of Labour Group. Small group with Plekhanov and a few more people in London. And that developed then over time, and using tactics and policies in the correct way, into the Third International, a revolutionary movement that evolved. And then there were the mass parties which were founded by Marxists. We always need to remember this as well. In Germany, the German Social Democratic Party was founded by Marxists. The same was true in France, in Spain, in Italy, and other countries. Marxists played a key role in building the mass movement. So we mustn't focus all the time on small groups and the experience of the small groups. We look at the development of Marxism and then the role that these originally small groups played. For example, in the 1890 Reichstag elections in Germany, the SPD won 1.4 million votes. And then in terms of splits are part and parcel of the movement. There's nothing new about what's happening here. When the British Social Democratic Federation was formed in 1883, it split within the year or two. One group under the leadership of Eleanor Marx, William Morris, Edward Aveling and others, and another group under Hindeman, who was quite a right-wing leader of the movement at the time. So splits that happen today are not new. The question is, how do you deal with these issues as they emerge in the movement? Looking at Britain, for example, look at the groups we have here. Left Unity, the Socialist Party, Left Horizon, Tusk, and I'm sure there's 100 more if you were to make the full list. I'm going back to when I worked in England in the 70s. There were a few groups which, there was the Socialist Labour League, which is a very big organisation. There's the International Socialists. There was the International Marxist Group, which belonged to the Fourth International. And of course, there was the RSL, which came from a split in the Revolutionary Communist Party and eventually developed into the Militant organisation. As I was thinking about this meeting, an experience struck me from my own time in London. Around 1973, the army were seen to be stopping cars and blocking roads on their way into the airport in London. There was some talk about, activity, and then all this kind of exaggerated stuff about a coup. But on May Day of that year, I went to the May Day rally, or I attended it, which was led by the Socialist Labour League. Now, at the time, there were a lot of artistic people like Vanessa Redgrave, actually all the Redgraves, I think, were involved. There was a very colourful parade with floats depicting the Chartist movement, the Petersfield massacre in Manchester, events of that nature. And then we finished up in Central Hall in Westminster. And then it was very stage managed, so there was all this silence for a period. And then Jerry Healy, the leader of the SLL, as it was called then, became the Workers' Revolutionary Party later. He walked onto the stage in silence with a lectern in front. This may be, I remember the quotation. Healy said, "This may be the last May Day rally that's going to be held in London. Next year, either we'll be in power, meaning the SLL, or the fascists." I wouldn't like to be making the choice there, but it was just a ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous comment. But I remember it because it's significant, because a lot of groups think in that way, that it falls to them to lead the revolution. Now, these are just general points I'm making. Comrades can talk about their own experiences in the movement, and we're hoping, as a result of this meeting, to develop a richer perspective, fuller understanding of two aspects. First of all, our experiences in these smaller left-wing groups, why they divide, why they split, why they become bankrupt, and also how do we apply Marxist ideas and the Marxist method in building the broad labour movement, building mass parties, and winning influence for Marxist ideas within these parties. Now, we're fortunate today to have John Dunn speaking. John has a long record, his history in the Orgreave strike of the miners in the mid-80s. He's still very much involved in the campaigns around that period, that arose in that period. And we're fortunate, and John has a lot of experience in the trade union movement, the labour movement, and also in left-wing groups. So we look forward to hearing John's contribution. But when John completes his contribution, we'd like all the comrades to contribute and to think about what their experience, what value their experience can have for building the movement today. So we don't want to hear a list of all how bad every other group is and all the mistakes they've made. We want to hear that, of course, but only in the context of learning from that and building a new movement that will avoid all the mistakes of the past. So hand over to you, John. You can talk for whatever length of time suits you, and then we'll have a discussion following that.
Thanks, Finn. I'm hoping it'll be relatively brief. Can I, before I start, just give an apology. If I start spluttering, I'm recovering from COVID, and the recovery is far worse than the virus was. I want to talk in particular about my experiences, good and bad, and the conclusions I've drawn from them. And I've no doubt that a lot of the things I say, people will disagree with me. Feel free to disagree with me, but just bear in mind I'll hunt you down and destroy you if you do. But I think it's important, with the state of the world as it is, and the fact that, Marxism is more relevant than ever, but as the groups have got smaller, etc., etc. And I was recruited to Militant way back in 1973 as a result of my involvement in the Clay Cross rent struggle at that time. I'd formed Clay Cross Young Socialists and came in touch with Militant through attending the Skegness conference, and I was actually recruited by Lynn Walsh, who was the nearest full-timer based in Manchester, I think. And later on, I made the mistake of joining Socialist Appeal, and I'll deal with these because I think my experiences, both good and bad, have led me to where I am today, and the joy I get from being very active in the movement, still doing what I've been doing for 30 odd years, with the odd lapse into alcoholism and depression in the past and that. But the thing about, let's start with Militant. that obviously was the most successful of all the groups, but then sort of died, you know, it self-destructed. And, you know, the great experiences I had in that, I think could be narrowed down to just a couple of things. You know, I met great comrades. I had a great education. And most importantly, it wasn't, you know, the Marxist literature that I read. It was about the application of and the understanding of how Marxism is a sort of lens through which we can view at times a very confusing and muddled world. The bad, for me personally, is how militant degenerated into sectarianism, elitism, and before I left, it had become very routinist and in fact arrogant with it. And a couple of examples personal to me that really got me looking at why I was bothering being involved at all was a regional full-timer. I was just having a general discussion with him about, you know, the sort of music I liked, and I was reading Sartre, one of his Roads to Freedom trilogy at the time, and this character ripped into me that you should not read existentialism because it's incompatible with Marxism, and Springsteen's lyrics are ridiculously simplistic. I suppose I should have just listened to Shostakovich and read Capital over and over again. And that got me thinking, if you can't enjoy the finer things in life, if you can't relax from time to time, then what good is it? And then in about 1988, which was the final straw for me, the region actually recruited a scab from our strike on the grounds that he'd suddenly become a militant, he'd become a bus driver. And I made the point that if he weren't prepared to give a year to his union, he would never put his life down for a revolution. But that fell on barren soil, and so I left. I've since found after, and this is an aside, that talk about power structures within these groups. Two full-timers are actually shagging my wife at the time. Not at the same time. I don't think any of them were that broad-minded, but the local full-timer knew my activities, so he was nipping around for his share, and the national full-timer working out the centre was organising so-called caucuses to attend to. And I think that, you know, that were the elitism of full-timers who were descended from the gods and could tell us how we should think. And since then, I've rethought a lot about why I got involved, the real lessons. And I think the biggest lessons I've learned have been the negative lessons. I then made the mistake of joining the IMT. I left that in 2015 when they covered up allegations of grooming of young schoolgirls by full-timers, but they, you know, they had taken on, I think, more, as many of these groups do, more the appearance of a cult. That they were the elite, they were the people who were going to descend into the working class at the time was right as a vanguard organisation and lead this ignorant class into revolution. And I think they particularly epitomise why these Marxist groups have not got anywhere over the years. And to me, it's this elitist evangelical attitude that we are building a vanguard, and as such we have to educate ourselves in order to educate these lesser beings, and the fact that they model themselves on the Russian Revolution to the extent of this so-called democratic centralism, which just keeps a few people in in positions with their, you know, central committees and their executive, and it's a sort of bubble mentality that that I think doesn't reflect the workers' movement. You know, most workers, you know, they come from a movement that elects its representatives regularly, elects its shop stewards, as a collective responsibility. And this whole democratic centralist model, I think not only, you know, is it alien to Britain, I think that's ultimately the organization in Russia that brought Stalin to power and saw the destruction of the Soviet Union. And I also think in recent years, and I hope nobody takes exception to this, that a lot of the Marxist left have become absolute miserable bastards. You know, we don't go around offering hope and look, this is the better world. You know, we tell people that we're all going to burst into flames in 10 years, that there's no way out of austerity under capitalism, to the point that the IMT used to tell workers it's no good fighting for reforms because capitalism will take it back. And this is a bit weird, but I had one of these Eureka moments a few years ago. I've tended to travel a lot. I know that, you know, amongst the new left, workers aren't supposed to have holidays because we're damaging the planet and things like that. But I was in a beautiful little town, coastal town in the south of Spain, Salabrina, and staying out of town in a little finca with hired amongst all these what would in Britain would be called smallholdings. They all grew fruit. And one day I noticed that there was a sort of drain, a culvert that was flowing with water. And one day I noticed that it wasn't flowing anymore. And as I walked further up the track, I saw that it had a sluice system. And this sluice system, in turn, each holder of each plot would drop a metal plate down and divert the water and actually flood his land as a form of irrigation. And that thing had obviously been there over 100 years. And I just thought, nobody taught these people. No Marxist, Alan Woods or Peter Taft didn't descend and say, this is how you do it. It was the ingenuity of ordinary people who built that. And as irrelevant as that seems, that, you know, that opened my eyes a little bit to where I think the mistakes I'd made and the mistakes that groups have been. None of them, I suppose, had read, you know, Trotsky's Problems of Everyday Life, which I did when I was fitting some double glazing, and it had no mention of that whatsoever. But I think that model, deifying, if you like, Lenin and Trotsky, has been very damaging in a way to our standing in the movement. And we all know people who at every meeting get up and show their great prowess, been making lengthy comments from Lenin, Marx, Engels, or Trotsky, when all workers want to hear is being fired up and you know, and a bit of agitation. I'm not saying that these things are wrong and don't have the place, but I think we've misapplied these over the. I say these are purely my opinions. I expect people to disagree. And this myth that the working class follows this linear program, that if this happens, the workers will move in this and that way. And that there's almost an on and off switch that Marxists can throw to ignite the working class. And again, going back to experience, and what I say about this Russian model was brought home to me. As Finn said, I was involved in our year-long strike, and we had a full-timer in Mansfield, in the heart of the Scab Knots coalfield, where a good number NUM members were actually on strike, and we had a great caucus of comrades in that area. And this full-timer instructed these strikers to cross the picket line and go back to work and agitate amongst the scabs to join the strike. He said that because that's what Lenin did. Lenin sent people to the front to agitate amongst the troops, and those people were broken. They were ostracized by the fellow strikers. They went in, came straight back out, but they were never ever the same again, and were lost to the movement. And in that strike, you know, not through reading great texts from Capital or the Communist Manifesto, we recruited 500 miners. Through being on the picket line, through getting beat, through getting attacked, through being there on the front line. And those 500 miners were lost just like that to Marxism. Because the very day the strike ended, Peter Taft, in his wisdom, pulled every full-timer that had been sent into the coalfields. And I rang him to ask him why. I said, you do know that the onslaught's going to come now. The strike was only the beginning. This is where we suffer the repercussions. And he said to me, John, you have to understand that you have been defeated, and it is our task to join the next struggle and lead that. I kid you not. And those 500, I bump into a lot of them at our events, you know, they've been lost. The nearest people in modern times in Britain have ever seen a revolution, have ever been involved in anything like that. So I think all that contributes to, you know, to where things have gone wrong. And just as an aside, I remember, as I say, I joined in 1973, and I used to go to all these meetings. You know, we were sent to readers' meetings, discussion groups, this, that, and the other. And the people kept talking about the proletariat, and I had no idea what the proletariat was. And I felt too ashamed to ask. I thought, you know, these people are going to, these highly educated people are going to think I'm thick. So after about 18 months of not knowing what they were on about, I summed up courage and asked somebody. They said, it's the working class. To which I replied, well, why don't we effing say that? And again, you know, that's a language that's alien to workers in our movement. Now, having said that, you know, I have got something positive out of it. As I say, I think Marxism, rather than the great literature, and obviously there's a lot of great literature in Marxism, and there's been a lot of great people who wrote that literature. Rather than that, to me, as I said, it's you know, it's this method, this application, this lens that we look at through. It's like, you know, you've needed spectacles and not known it, and suddenly you can see the colours, the world, you can see things, you can read in proper detail. So it's the application, the method of Marxism, I think, that I enjoy. And through it, you know, I look at the world and I see this beautiful place, and it makes me want to fight even harder to save it. And at the moment, I'm reading the late great John Throne's book, We'll Take a Cup of Kindness Yet. And it talks like that, you know, about seeing the art in everything, the way that, you know, the peasant farmers in Ireland plough the fields, the way that they groom the horses. And I thought, to me, that sums it up, you know, that we see the positive side of everyday life. And as I say, you know, I've rambled a bit. I think that we have to get away. The one thing I like about being involved in WIN is I don't agree with everybody and everything, but it's got away from this centralized format. It allows discussions like this, where people are free to disagree. There, you know, there is no central line that's come from some great being on high. And, you know, I think that we have to look at that, and that's what we have to grab with both hands, that it's not looking back into the past, it's not applying, as I've said previously, the lessons of the Russian Revolution that happened in a totally different country with a totally different working class. I think we have to look at our class in Britain and throughout the world where they are, where it is. They're not going to be switched on and off. They're not suddenly going to rise up. It's our job as activists, as Marxists, to get in there, but talk to them in a language they understand. Talk to them and share their experiences, that, you know, that their struggles, and listen to them. And I think we can learn more from the working class than we can actually give at this moment in time. You know, we've suffered a tremendous series of defeats since the 1980s, but there are signs that in Britain and in the US, from what I read, that the class are starting to regroup. You know, the election in Unite of Sharon Graham, you know, I got a lot of stick for endorsing her and supporting her, you know, and a lot, oh, they're only reformists, we can't trust the trade union leaders, you know, and we have to have leaders somewhere. And I've had the privilege of following, you know, perhaps the greatest trade union leader for all his flaws that this country's ever seen, Arthur Scargill. So I know, you know, what a strong leadership means to people. And as I say, you know, let's learn, let's listen, let's look at things as it is and not how we would want it to be. And just lately, I've been reading Gramsci, who I think today is far more relevant, I'll be honest, than Lenin and Trotsky. And one of his quotes that, you know, I think is extremely relevant to the situation that we're in and that capitalism throughout the world is in, where he says, the old is dying, but the new cannot be born. We live in a time of monsters, and it's up to us to show the working class how to, you know, how they can have the strength to slay these monsters, to explain to workers that, you know, a job is not something that you're entitled to, it's something you do just to stay alive, to earn the means of subsistence. And not a light would come on, not a wheel would turn unless we made it turn. And in that lies the tremendous strength of our movement, especially under capitalism, the new unions. And, you know, we no longer have the miners, the steel workers, the engineers in this country. But we have a new form of hedge fund capitalism that we have to understand. But we also have to look at the potential of who are the potentially strongest workers. It's people like Usdo, lorry drivers. A lot of firms exist on an 8-hour turnover. If you stop that, you cut off the means of production. You bring capitalism to an end. And I think by looking at it, as I say, how it is and not how we'd like to be, we can learn a lot and emerge stronger with a clearer purpose and a clearer direction. Sorry if it's rambled, but that's my personal feeling.
Thank you very much, John. That's an excellent opening contribution for the discussion. It sets the tone for the discussion for now. If you don't mind, I just select a couple of points that you made that we might spend time looking at. One is the important point of listening to workers, learning from the experience of workers, and recognizing the skills and the abilities that workers have. You also mentioned the struggle for reforms, which is a very important aspect of the work we all do in trade unions and other similar organizations. Incidentally, Marx fought for reform of the Factory Act and the not 8 hours, but the reduction of the working week and stuff like that in his time. So it's not wrongly struggled for reforms, recognising, of course, the fact that capitalism can't afford to allow reformism to develop in the way it would happen in the past. You also alluded, John, to the elitism of leadership and some horrific consequences of that in your own personal experience, the elitism of the leadership of the left groups. You mentioned the democratic centralism and the role that that might play. And then you gave the example of the 500 miners who joined the Marxist movement, only to become disillusioned and to leave, which is a crime. When workers move towards Marxism, they're valuable. It's like gold dust in the movement, and they should be treated in a respectful and a respectful way, and we must recognise the skills they bring to the movement. I just picked these points out that we might highlight in the discussion. Now, there's a range of hands in the air. While I was talking, I didn't see which one was coming in first, so I'll start with Peter St. Clair.
Hi, comrades. Thanks, John. I'd just like to echo what John's been saying there, in particular the messaging. Very often you hear comrades, so-called those on the left, making pronouncements of ancient, what I say, language. That, and John explained it with the simple word to us anyway, proletarianism, which to a man in the street or a woman in the street, it's meaningless. And actually what it has, in my opinion, is an alternative effect of what you're trying to do. Now, fairly recently, as far as I'm concerned, if you keep the message simple, basic, and offer to the listener, to the viewer, then you're going to get a better response and start talking in Marxist, Trotskyist, and whatever terms. Anyone who's in struggle isn't really interested in that type of language. They're more interested in the simple message and what you are going to do to help them. This is the reason why Jeremy Corbyn was quite successful in what he was undertaking. He could draw massive crowds in any kind of weather, as we've seen fairly recently in modern history. And it was that terrified the right. Jeremy Corbyn, and he's not the only one, there'll be others sooner or later, as soon as he espoused something that the working classes want to hear, then they'll dive on him like a ton of bricks. And that's exactly why Corbyn had to be destroyed. You see, at meetings like this, when we're like-minded people, it isn't such a problem to be talking in the terms I've expressed and John's clearly expressed. But when talking outside of these types of meetings, it's utterly important. Now, when I was secretary of the South Tyneside branch of Militant in the 70s and 80s, it was made perfectly clear that when the full-timers would come and offer contributions to the members, that it was kept short, simple, to the point. There is no point in me attempting to try and gather and build a socialist branch in the area when somebody's going to come in and start talking something they've got nothing in common with. We had quite a good branch for quite a number of years in South Tyneside until, as John said, whatever happened, I don't know. I mean, just all over in one flash. I wasn't told anything. I suspect John was the same. He found out. Well, it just didn't simply exist anymore. What he did so, though, was rung true with me. Many of them, the full-timers, have done very, very well for themselves. I can only speak for the northeast of England. Very well indeed. Many of them hold considerably well-paid jobs, totally out of sync with what they were telling us to believe all those years ago. And, that's all I'd like to say, comrades. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. I give a list now of comrades in the order that I've seen them on the screen. The next speaker is Matthew, followed by Antula, followed by Roger, followed by David. So, Matthew.
Okay, hi comrades. Yeah, this is a useful discussion. I'm going to disagree with John here. He can come and put me down later. I mean, I think that really that it is a profound question. I mean, obviously, why is it we're in the situation we're in which we have a handful of people discussing these issues, and not a mass of folk under conditions in which clearly the system is in gross crisis, and why is it that we have a situation where the left is in the state it's in? And that's a very profound question. You could spend hours, and I could spend hours talking about it. And go through the whole piece. I mean, it's a huge question. I think we have to start with some really basics. For me, I mean, in terms of, I joined the movement at the age of 15. Well, with a bunch of other people. People obviously you start as young as you possibly can. It's much easier to learn when you're young. And obviously, at a time in which there was a vibrant movement and so on, and people wanted to change the world. People still want to change the world. I mean, I think that the core question for me is to say, right, okay, what we can apply, and any given thing is to ask the question why, which is a question now reserved for Marxists and small children. Because obviously the capitalist class does not want to answer that question, does not wish to ask that question or have it said anywhere. It wishes to wipe that question out. It wishes to say, well, the world will never change, and it's always been like that. We'll always be in charge, and you lot better get on with it. And every so often we'll come down and grind you down. But clearly not. And I think it is to say, right, how do you actually try to understand the world? And for that, I mean, you actually have to say, we have to incite people to actually study. I mean, and this is the thing. I mean, as Marx points out, I mean, obviously, the world is, the thing about capitalism is it's an obscure system. It's not clear. It's not obvious as to how it works, because as he goes through in some detail, actually in Grundrisse in particular, that exactly things are invert. Actual social relations appear as things like money, and things appear as social relations. Things are stood on their head all the time under capitalism. This is one of the reasons why the system survives, because actually it can obscure the fact that what you have is a small class of people extorting effectively the rest of the world, and imposing a system of violence and exploitation on everybody. But managing to obscure that fact. And I think that it's actually to say, well, can we bring that understanding to a mass of people and say, look, we understand that this is the nature of the society, and we can be rid of these people. And precisely that's the project that Marx set. That our job is to liberate humanity from class oppression, the key oppression, that we actually want to change the whole nature of the society and say, right, okay, well, the pre-human society as it's been for thousands of years, with one classes ruling over each other and the rest of it, is a form of prehistory. For humanity to realise itself, has to actually break away from that. And that the job of the working class, actually, to become a class itself, is to liberate humanity. And actually, in becoming an actual class, abolish all classes, including itself. And that's precisely the point. And I think that under what we've got in the conditions at the moment, obviously, is quite peculiar. I mean, obviously, we're standing at a situation in which, the other thing, of course, Marx says, and rightly, is that the history lives on as a nightmare. Actually, we don't get to operate or work or live in circumstances dictated by ourselves. They're dictated by, past events, by, traditions and all this sort of stuff. So, history is imposed upon us, and it change. It's something we have to work with, and we have to understand. And it's precisely that, doing that, that makes. I think that the effort to say, okay, you can just sort of take stuff that's in Lenin and Trotsky or whatever, and they are brilliant. I mean, absolutely fabulous. But you can't just write it, and I think that's right. You can't just say, okay, you can write across and say, right, okay, well, the demands of Russia across to Britain or whatever else, that's right. But actually, it's the level of understanding that you can use. You know, it's a fact also that besides obviously the complexity of the system itself, it's the fact it's also, as Lenin and Trotsky clearly understood and rightly, and the other comrades have worked on, is it's actually in decline itself. The capitalism itself is actually declining and degenerating, and the system becomes more obscure in that because it actually doesn't function in its right way. And I think that the other point, of course, I think besides obviously the nature of society, is what we come from is the fact that we exist in a period in which we've been through the impact, particularly of Stalinism and the degeneration of the Great Russian Revolution, which I mean is actually, I mean, and should be and has to be celebrated as the greatest event in human history. As Serge says, this is the event that points the way to the future, whatever its flaws, because it actually opens the whole bloody thing up and says, right, and did immense and incalculable damage to the operation of capitalism itself. Capitalism never recovered from the Russian Revolution, had to concede hugely to the working class, had to concede to the left, is still unable to go back to what it had previously. But the problem was that the degeneration of that revolution, the counter-revolution, the thermidor, as Trotsky said, of Stalinism, it does huge damage to the left, enormous damage. You have a counter-revolutionary force, something that pretends to be revolutionary. And I mean, we've seen the CP around us, and particularly, I mean, you can go through all the, obviously, in mining, of course, there was huge numbers of CP who played an absolutely rotten role, particularly actually during the '84 strike. But that's a microcosm, and obviously the CP were far worse. I mean, if you look at what happened in Russia and elsewhere, the impact of the CP is to exterminate the revolution, actually to physically liquidate all the people who held all that lesson, who held all that experience, of actually creating a real revolution in Russia and that, understanding, and you're left with small fragments. I mean, if you look at the Trotskyism movement,
sorry, Matt, could you start drawing your remarks to a conclusion?
The problem is that the Trotskyism movement itself comes from very marginal beginnings and marginal areas and so on. Does not have, only has roots in the working class in certain places. Like in the US, where it has some implantation in the 30s, like in Cape Town, where Ted Grant comes from, and all this sort of stuff, and like actually in Britain. But of course, in Britain, of course, the level of politics has always been terrible. The British left has always been awful in terms of its level of understanding. So it's not hardly surprising, and I think, as I say, we can go on for ages of this. If you look at the history of it, actually it comes down to the point that the level of political understanding in this country among all the groups, and I think in the Trotskyists above all, because I think that they're the ones that, if we say Trotskyism is the true heritage of revolutionary politics, there is no other really. It sets itself a very high level, but in Britain it falls down. That's the point. And we can look at all the groups. You can go through it. As I say, you could spend hours doing it. I'm quite happy to do that. So thanks, guys.
Thanks, Matt. I don't like interrupting comrades as they speak, but I'd have to ask comrades to be quite restrained in what they say and to limit what they're saying, and in particular to focus on the specific points that John raised in his opening contribution. There's a danger of the discussion being so general it doesn't actually nail down the issues that we need to examine in some detail. But thanks for your contribution, Matt, and I'm asking other comrades to be a bit restrained and to limit themselves to a shorter period. The next speaker is Antula Papadopoulou. I see your hand. Is that?
I'm sorry, I didn't ask to speak.
Oh, I see. Sorry, there's a hand. Okay, there's a hand beside your name there. Okay, comrade, sorry for that. Next speaker then is Roger.
Okay, yeah, thank you. First of all, thanks to John for a really stimulating and original and refreshing contribution, which is, of course, what we would expect from him every time. Why the collapse of the left? I would say the first thing to understand is that they're living in a time warp. They're completely incapable of understanding that things have changed since 1938. They've taken their sort of religious text, if you like, from the transitional program in 1938, and they've completely failed to see the transformation of the world around them since then. In the late 19th and the 20th century, millions of workers were paid up members of mass socialist and communist internationals and parties. Today, those parties have gone. The Italian Communist Party, for instance, was the biggest communist party in the world outside of Russia. In other words, in a capitalist country. It's vanished completely without trace. The Swedish Social Democrats just got their worst election results since 1918. The French Socialist Party, which was in power only a few years ago, of the presidency, the National Assembly, and the regions, they are now scoring 1.5% in opinion polls. Even the SPD, the German SPD, which is in power, but their vote is now about 25% of the electorate, and it always used to be nearer 50%. Of course, in Britain, there was a kind of paradoxical spurt, but the left and the Labour Party is, for now, once again atomized. And for decades now, Marxists now are mostly reduced to constantly splitting, inward-looking cliques. Now, what's the explanation for this? First of all, I mean, I completely agree with all the almost ludicrous, farcical mistakes that they make, and we could give a long list of them. But I think the first explanation is not primarily the mistakes, although they've been monumental. The leaders, after all, of the socialist and communist parties made literally catastrophic mistakes and betrayals, and yet they still retained mass support in the period we're talking about. The mistake of the left sects is that they have not noticed the fundamental objective changes around them. The deindustrialization in the West, the erosion of the concentrated industrial communities and the trade union traditions that existed before. In most of the so-called Western countries, the old industrial communities have gone. That doesn't mean that the working class has gone, but it's taken on a completely different character. The old, what used to be regarded as the kind of middle class in society have become proletarianized. And there are also new strata of workers who have still to learn the very basic lessons that were learned more than a century ago by the industrial working class of the past. We have now, the bit I keep making this point, but I think it's important to keep it in mind that the biggest strikes in Britain in the last few years have been those of hospital doctors and university lecturers and teachers. And on the other, also at the same time, we have the beginnings of mobilizations of couriers, delivery drivers, fast food workers, Uber drivers, and so on. In the time of the miners' strike, which John was talking about, 60% of the population in Britain, according to very conservative and respectable sociological organizations, 60% regarded themselves as working class. Today, the same organizations conducted the same surveys, report that exactly the same number, 60% still consider themselves to be working class in Britain. And I think that's a very important and a very encouraging statistic. And most of all, and something that Wynne has pointed out, and I haven't seen anybody else ever mention it, but it's the crucial thing, that the working class internationally is now a majority of the population and involves men and women equally, perhaps women even to the fore. The proletariat has become a majority, but it's a new proletariat, and and certain things flow from that. We want what we try to do is to give a serious Marxist explanation for the historical basis of the sectarian degeneration that John has described to the left groups. We have to avoid dogmatism. That's the point. But we're reaching towards a kind of collective outlook with ample room for constant re-examination and review. But the old left still operates as if the proletariat was still mobilized in millions, and the task is simply to pose an alternative leadership, to be an alternative vanguard. And for instance, this question of democratic centralism. I mean, obviously, as a principle, it's correct. Unity in action, and the necessary corollary of that, democratic discussion. We call that the law of the picket line projected onto the political plane. However, internal democracy and political clarity are two sides of the same coin, and every little sect today insists upon a rigid display of unanimity, all in the name of a sort of grotesque distortion of Bolshevism. And the implication of these sectarians that the expression of alternative views is equivalent to strike breaking is absolutely ridiculous. And the reason we keep raising this issue of the abusive malpractices of the left sects under the guise of democratic centralism is that it has directly practical and deadly consequences. Because if we have a hidebound leadership which is constitutionally shielded from criticism and correction and protected from the challenge of healthy democratic debate, is organically incapable of avoiding political mistakes. It may begin only with secondary nuances, but over a period, it cannot but lead over a period to major deviations and ultimately to colossal blunders. And that's what happened with militants. So most of us come from the militant tradition. And over a period, I mean, for 30 years or more, Militant never had an internal, a serious internal division because its ideas really were rooted in reality, and there was no particular reason to challenge them. But over a period and gradually, because they got into this habit where the leadership was retreated with reverence, if you like, with almost a religious awe, that the end result was that it was completely at odds with reality. It was completely shocked, and it split into smithereens. It split into fragments at the end of it. As Lenin pointed out, a mistake that is uncorrected for long enough ultimately becomes a tendency, and that's exactly what happened. And rather than trying in advance to exercise any risk of dissent, we always welcome dissent and controversy and debate and discussion as the only possible surety against the likelihood of future major blunders. And I think we prove that. It's not me saying that. We're proving it by these meetings, week after week after week, where we have open forums, and we won't tolerate, we encourage the maximum possible debate, and we listen to the experiences. If you don't mind, if I can speak just another couple of minutes on that.
A couple of minutes,
you know, today, you look around the world, the millions are on the move, and they're improvising, they're learning, they're furiously debating. And in such a period, the hackneyed, preconceived formulae of the past can only take us so far. Again and again, at the high points of history, it was always the creative energies of workers in struggle which showed the way forward. And the mark of the great revolutionaries of the past was not their imposition of preconceived formulae, but their insight in interpreting and grasping the lessons of life as it unfolded. And in such a period, the distinguishing mark of a revolutionary is as much to listen and learn and assimilate the lessons as to teach. Let me give a couple of examples from history. It was, again, I have mentioned these before, but I think it's the key thing about Marx and Engels and Lenin and Trotsky and Ted Grant in his heyday in the early years was the way that they listened and they learned from experience, and not that they came dictating preconceived formulae. It was the workers of Paris in the Commune of 1871 who demonstrated to Marx, and not the other way round, the necessity of smashing and replacing the bourgeois state machine rather than simply commandeering the existing machine. And Marx's genius consisted above all in his ability to watch, to listen, and to learn from their experience and condense it into a theoretical conclusion. Again, St. Petersburg in 1905, it was by their own spontaneous improvisation that the workers demonstrated in action the crucial role of the Soviets as democratic organs of workers' power. And that was to the dismay of the local Bolshevik leaders, who were initially skeptical and distrustful of what they perceived as a threat to their precious leading role of the party. They refuted in action Lenin's earlier acknowledged mistaken formula that it needed a revolutionary intelligentsia to raise workers above a mere trade union consciousness. Again, Lenin learned from the working class, not the other way around. It was the actual course of the Russian Revolution which corrected Lenin's earlier formulations of its tasks as a democratic dictatorship of the workers and peasantry, and which demonstrated also to Trotsky, as he freely admitted later, the imperious necessity of a centralized Bolshevik party. Both Lenin and Trotsky learned from their mistakes by watching and keeping their finger on the pulse of the movement as it developed. And so today, in the absence of a revolutionary leadership, we're in the midst of a worldwide uprising. There's millions of people marching, mobilizing, striking, occupying public squares for weeks on end, and obviously engaging in a hothouse of political debate. We can be sure that their discussions will have at least as much to teach us as whatever abstract lessons we may have gleaned from our study of the textbooks. And so the first duty, as again, entirely in line with what John said, the first duty is to keep our finger on the pulse, to listen, to learn, not to see ourselves as coming from the outside to teach, but to listen and keep the finger on the pulse and learn from the movement as it develops. Marx and Engels never had the need to declare themselves a vanguard party before they plunged into the pioneering work of the First International. They were just part of that international, and they put their ideas, and they won the debate. And it was simple, and that's how we have to see it too. I have got other examples that I could give, but I won't take up any more time. But I do think that the lesson is exactly as John said, that we have to have a modest appreciation of what our role is, and not to see ourselves as teachers or leaders, but to see ourselves simply as trying to draw conclusions alongside our comrades in the struggle as to what's the best way forward, and to interact and to discuss on that basis. So thank you.
Thank you, Roger. The next three speakers are David, followed by Silvana, followed by Dominic. Can comrades please limit their contributions to, say, a maximum of 5 minutes? Because there are other speakers after them. So we have David, Silvana, and Dominic. David.
Right, thanks, comrades. Well, look, my contribution is going to relate to the objective necessity for Marxist analysis and organization of society around Marxist ideas. Can I say that a few days ago, one of the seasoned strugglers in South Africa, not a Marxist, came to the conclusion that post-apartheid society is at a lower level than under apartheid. And it has now become filthy, selfish, and greedy. And that is the characteristic of post-apartheid society. So I want us to look at the crisis which is around us and see what is coming out and how we should build. Because at the same time as we have this disgusting degeneration of society, so that the train system in South Africa, the entire transport and cargo train system in South Africa has fallen apart completely without a shell being fired under the weight of the national bourgeoisie and the African National Congress. We see at the same time the rise of the Clover strike of workers that have now been on strike for 5 months and giving a shining example of how workers can unite and fight against, as it turns out, an Israeli company in South Africa and bring together all the working class. Now, why am I mentioning this? It's just consider, this is the greatest struggle the world has seen probably after the abolition of slavery, the struggle against apartheid. And now we have under capitalism such a miserable result. And it all goes back to the struggle that we've had, and we've lost for a while, but we're struggling and we will regain it. The idea, the fundamental ideas of Marxism. So could I just mention briefly that at the time of the 1960s, long before I'd met Ted Grant or anyone else, I and others had come to the conclusion that we had to have Marxist ideas, but society was completely polarized on a racial division, white and black. So what on earth was Marxism to do with this? And people laughed at us when we said that the ideas of Marxism were relevant. Because how were you going to unite white workers with black workers? It seemed absolutely impossible. So it was a ludicrous idea. We just had to struggle for reforms on a racial basis in some possible way. We watched what is happening and we learned from society. In 1969, there was an incredible strike of dock workers, which paralyzed at the heat of apartheid, paralyzed Durban port, the major port of South Africa, and showed there was something called the black working class, and it was flexing its muscles. And we orientated to that. And around that, we went and met the workers. We weren't able to see the dock workers, but the workers, because they were in barracks with almost a military control, but we met with abattoir workers, meat house workers, and sat and listened and drank with them the beer, which came in tin gallons, and passed it around and learned from them. And they said, we want organization. You must work with us and help us organize. And that is the basis on which society then led to the 1973 strikes, some of the greatest strikes that South Africa has ever had then or later, which has actually moved whole segments of society right across industry and elsewhere. The problem has been how to organize and how to keep worker-controlled trade unions and to develop a Marxist cadre which will last over time. That all was something like 50 years ago, and now we're still struggling to build the apparatus. And for all the reasons that John has explained and Roger has gone into greater depths, we have to base ourselves on the science of society and explain to the world, and particularly where we have such national and racial polarization, that capitalism as an objective process leads towards wages and profit. That's the division of all production. And around that, if we are not united as a working class, the greater section goes to profits and to our humiliation and to our exploitation. And we have to devise every means possible to be able to work ourselves out in cooperation around key ideas, face the facts, and look at our scars, but not be torn apart and not focus only on our scars, to be able to see fresh layers of struggle coming in, as we see in America, into the movement and build around those ideas modestly, as we've explained, but also with some expertise, learning and conducting ourselves in the most efficient manner possible so that we become the core of Marxist ideas, the core of revolution, which will take society forward out of the barbarism, because we're already in that stage of barbarism, into a society in which there will be decency, all those platitudes, and socialism. Thank you. Mm.
Thank you, David. It's 5 minutes exactly. Very good. Our next speaker is Silvana.
Hi, good afternoon. I just agree with everybody talking about how we can learning at the same time when we are listening to the cross groups. In fact, in Brazil, we are trying to go back to the basics because we had this coup in Brazil in 2016, where we had this President Dilma. She was took out of the government with no reason at all. And then we learned from that, we need to be talking to people. We need to be there, listening to the workers' otherwise we lose the point, the timing. Right now we have, about 8 months ago, we started with Nova Primavera. That means new, is a spring is coming, like again. And we are based on Paulo Freire. I don't know if you guys heard about him, but like listening to you guys now, I realized that is also part of Marx's point of view that we need to listen to in order, because everybody learn from each other. It's not like you know everything, I don't know nothing. We all are here learning at the same time. So we have this big election coming in again. Lula is free and he's trying to come back as the president, and we are working very hard. So we have all these committees building up in the base so that we can work together with the workers and show to them and talk to them what we have been doing for when we were in power for 13 years, that we can improve, we can make change and see where we went wrong. Also here, I moved from the UK, now I'm here in the United States. So I have a new place here with the PT. I'm the new coordinator of the Partido dos Trabalhadores here. So I'm very happy that I can help more the work party here. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Silvana. Next speaker is Dominic.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple of points. I think John, in his lead-off, was going on about democratic centralism, which for somebody who was involved in a miners' strike that involved the use of democratic centralism seemed to me a little bit strange, because I think what you got in the militant and what you've got in other organisations is not democratic centralism. It's almost a priesthood. It's a cultish attitude towards things. And the way John was talking about full-timers in the late 80s and 90s, they have no understanding whatsoever about Marxism, in my view. They were clowns, they were a joke. They'd not been taught anything. They've not been taught to understand. And worst of all, they've not been taught to think. And I think that's the main thing that we've got to be involved in. Because to me, democratic centralism, from what I understand of it, goes back to prehistory, goes back to tribal society, true tribal society, where you had democracy. And if you were going to do something like go to war or do something else with the land or whatever, you'd have a meeting, you'd come to a decision, and everybody would agree at the end of the day to agree with the majority. And that's what happens in a trade union. You don't go on strike and wait for the last vote to come yes. You take a majority decision, and that's what you're doing. And that's democratic centralism to me. It's not some sort of dogma that's used as an excuse not to discuss ideas. And I think that's what you got in Militant. And I think Ted, very early on, to my mind, I don't know, I'm going back to the early 70s, was dead against factional rights and splits. I think I put it down to his experience with the RCP and the results of that. But there was no discussions about factions. If somebody formed a faction in Militant, they were shown the door, basically. You had a few weeks discussion and that was it, and you were out. That's my experience of what happened. And certainly it was the experience towards the end, as far as I was concerned, was when the turn was...
You're frozen, Dominic. Yeah. There's no sound coming from you, Dominic.
Some down like some saint from the mountain and say, here's the tablets of stone and this is what you have to do. That's an absolute nonsense of an idea. And the other thing that got me as well was the question of theory, because I think theory is really important, but you've got to understand Marxist theory, at least the basics that I know of, to explain what capitalism's about. If you don't understand the labour theory of value, I don't see how you can understand how capitalism functions, what it's all about. I remember when I was at work, which is a long time ago now, I used to draw up a wage claim, was on the Joint Office Committee, I was a draftsman. We had a Joint Office Committee in the works, I drew up the wage claim, explained how the employers made their profits, not through some magic that they carried out, which is what capitalism would have you believe. The capitalists are absolutely vital to society because they've got this genius of creating wealth. It's absolute nonsense. The wealth is produced by the working class, and the capitalists steal a large part of the value of the labour that the workers, the wealth that the workers produce. And I think he used to put that into the wage claim, not as a theory of value, but explaining how they did it. And you've got to understand the theory to get it over in more, if you like, day-to-day language. And I think those are two things that, to me, are sort of important. Because, I did, after I finished work, I had to leave on health grounds. When I had not been too bad, I used to do a bit of education or further education. I went to the Poly in Manchester for a bit on a course. We were doing economics, and the sort of nonsense they talked about, how wealth was created. But I mean, it's only there 3 months when I had to pack it in. But you got some guy who was telling you, who read a book about, who was telling you that the value of a small oak tree and a large oak tree were exactly the same as far as capitalism is concerned. And how does Marx explain this with the labour theory of value? So I did a little bit on it and said, well, it takes a lot longer to chop a big oak tree down than a little oak tree. It takes a lot longer to get the wood and all the rest of it. So I think we've got to put it over in sort of not simple terms, straightforward terms that people understand. And the idea that a leadership has got some cult status is ridiculous. The leadership should have an understanding of the working class, preferably by working. That's how you understand how the working class operates, not from a book, but by being a worker. And it's important that we recruit workers and try and get them to have an idea of what Marxist theory is about. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Dominic. The next speaker is Ed.
Thank you. Well, I've got a lot out of this discussion, out of John's contribution and the contributions of other comrades. And just to pick up on a few things, I completely agree with Silvana that learning involves listening, and it's a sort of interactive process where we learn and listen. And every time we're involved in a discussion, even with the newest and most youngest or rawest recruit to the movement, we always learn ourselves from that discussion, as well as perhaps having something to give and something to teach. In terms of democratic centralism, I'd just like to kind of carry on what Dominic was talking about. The principle of the picket line is that once you've made a decision to go on strike, you then insist and try your utmost to ensure that 100% of the workforce adhere to that decision. And that for me is democratic centralism. It's nothing to do with esoteric discussions about who's right on this aspect of debate or that aspect of debate and having to respect some leadership. It's to do with the principles around which workers have to organise to be effective as a class. In terms of this discussion about the use of language and the use of technical terms, I'm not sure if I quite agree with John that we shouldn't be using any technical terms. Every worker knows that in his or her field of work, there are technical terms. We have to study that technology in order to be able to do our job properly. And it's the same with understanding society.
I mean, human society is far more complicated than the human body, but it takes a doctor 6 years of study in order to be equipped to understand how to operate on the human body. We have to have, in the course of our education and training, we have to have technical terms. The thing is, what we don't want to do is use those technical terms to put ourselves as on some pedestal above the rest of the working class. We use those technical terms in, I mean, things like, exploitation, the labour theory of value, like Dominic was talking about. These are things that require study. They are things that require, certain technical language, but we have to use it in a way that is relevant and becomes a living part of the struggle, and not as something that is only for the leadership, so to speak. Leadership, incidentally, is something that will be built out of class struggle. And I completely agree with what comrades John and Roger and others have said, that those little groups who present themselves as leaderships will be bypassed by the movement of events. There are, at the moment, there are millions of people talking about socialism in every country. They're talking about things like health services, funding for schools, transportation, how things can be improved, how prices can be held down so that we don't have to pay these appalling inflationary rates that are going around at the moment. There are millions of people that are talking about the issues from which arise socialist ideas, and it's the movement of those millions of people that will create. I mean, one of the key issues, in my opinion, in this debate is how we go from millions of people talking about how unjust the world is, and how and how something needs to be done about that. How we go from that to the beginning of the construction of new mass parties that have revolutionary potential. And in the course of that, all kinds of new ideas will come up, and the old ideas that are to be found in Marx's Capital, in Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution and so on, will find a new relevance, and some of their terms and some of their expressions will be relevant to these new debates as well. That's it, comrades. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. I don't see, Ian. Ian, your hand is up there. Ian?
No, I was just clapping.
Oh, okay, yes, okay. I just saw the hand. Yes, okay. So, does any other comrade want to speak? Does any other comrade want to speak a second time? Just come back in on the discussion. Okay. Matt, your hand is up again, is it?
Yeah, no, I think what the other thing, of course, to look at is, as comrades have said, is the record of the groups. I mean, particularly, I suppose for us in Britain, it's the fact that, really, you have to go through and say, why is it that we wind up in a situation whereby masses of people have been members of groups, including all of us, and been through a lot of decades. I mean, you look at, as I say, the post-war British Trotskyist movement spans, since 1945, and actually Trotskyist movement in Britain goes back to the early 30s, and people have written that up. Certainly the early parts of the Trotskyist movement written up quite well by the Revolutionary History Group. And you can look at it through all this sort of stuff. So, well, why is it we wind up in this situation, and whereby we have created a series of sects, as I say, under conditions in which you have Stalinism, and which was a blockage towards revolution, clearly, and towards development of revolutionary politics. But also, under conditions in which, there was a relative freedom in Britain. In those terms, and we didn't have a mass communist party, fortunately for us. Unlike people having to operate in France or Italy, there wasn't that obstacle in the way. But these things failed over and over again under conditions in which there were, opportunities were certainly offered, and in which there were very serious battles took place, in the class struggle in which Trotsky still had a major influence, and whether that's going back to the 60s or the 70s or the strikes of the 80s, and all of those things. But in all of those cases, essentially those organisations failed to put forward a serious program in most cases, and failed to build themselves to any mass size. And at the same time, also, of course, were internally profoundly anti-democratic. This is a fundamental thing. That you have a position in which most of these organisations actually functioned became themselves a sort of remote bureaucracy, in which a small group of people effectively dictated everything. People were not engaged in mass debate to any degree, in which, as far as I understand it in Militant, I wasn't a member of Militant, but full-timers the Militants were actually appointed from the centre and not elected. There was no accountability. And in which as I say, given the opportunities presented, there was a huge failure, and really, I know that the comrades of revolutionary history, who published for the best part of 20 years, actually went through this over a whole period, which is very useful. But they refused to go beyond a certain point because they didn't want to offend the living, which is unfortunate, because I think some of the living did need to be offended very seriously, because obviously they committed serious mistakes. And those need to be corrected. And the problem is also we wind up with situations and say, where you have these sort of self-sustaining bureaucracies, which are in some cases almost inheritable, in which people, it's almost like a miniature form of Stalinism, in which we have the last holdout of infallibility. So actually you block yourself from learning anything because, of course, you're always right. There's no point discussing it because you always are right. You've always been right. And there's no point in actually, you can't learn anything because you're right, just the way it is. In that sense, you need to go back over and say, well, okay, why is it we wind up with these things, and how do we do it differently? How is it the position? How do we get to a position in which we actually look at the state of an organisation? We say that the membership of the organisation are deeply important, and the democracy and the internal functioning of the organisation is of extreme importance, in terms of its actual health and viability and seriousness, in relation to the working class and learning from the struggle that goes on, and as comrades have noted, the question of saying have a dialectical relation between the members of the organisation and the working class, and that each side obviously takes something from the relationship, and at the same time, obviously, that organisation, any revolutionary organisation has an organic link. We can see it. However dysfunctional, whatever else the revolutionaries of Britain have been and are, it's actually related clearly to the level of the class struggle, absolutely plainly. And there is this very, very clear link, and you can see, the decline, the rise and decline of these organisations actually tracks, the level of the class struggle, as we might expect. But it's to say, okay, well, how can we sort of take some of these horrible examples? You can go through these organisations. As I say, I didn't think Militant were particularly good in terms of their internal regime, but they were by no means the worst. and organisations like the SWP or ISSWP tradition, who just spent, as basically spent their time flinging people out. Every few years they fling out another lot of people who disagreed.
Could you finish up shortly, Matt, please?
Okay, thank you.
David, you wanted to speak again?
Yeah, thanks. I just want to really speak about the necessity to have some form of mutual defense through Marxists organizing together to defend the ideas, first of all, and to be able to protect each other. I just want to make a tribute to the work that has been done in the past. I know we're discussing the way in which it's disintegrated, broken up, and we're struggling now to bring it all together again. But, when I and 12 others were detained in Zimbabwe, we knew that we were not alone and that there were comrades in Europe, in America, and particularly in Britain, who were fighting for us. So that when the interrogation started, they would ask, who are these guys in Parliament? They're causing a lot of fuss, and we knew we were not alone. It's impossible to really to have the confidence of going forward in countries in Asia and Africa where the bullet in the head is the solution for most autocrats to their opposition, for those who are struggling, anti-war activists in Russia, for those who are struggling in Belarus and elsewhere, to know that they can continue in the struggle unless they know there is some trade union, a trade union of revolutionaries, of socialists who are going to fight for them. And you're not alone. We are fighting with you. And it's that spirit that we've also got to build, take up and build, to be able to understand how we can struggle internationally and why we are struggling internationally. It makes it very clear, particularly to those comrades, if I could mention it, who are relatively free from oppression. It's for those comrades in Africa, not so much in South Africa, although who knows, what's happening next. But throughout Africa, there are people who are encircled, their houses have been cut off from water, electricity, and the rest in Namibia. And in Zimbabwe, it's a matter of struggle for life or death just to survive. And if you don't know that there's some group out there who's prepared to take up your struggle and fight for you, really, you're not a revolutionary. Well, we are not a revolutionary group. We have to support other revolutionaries, and that's the bottom line. Could I mention in conclusion that right now we have a campaign for those comrades on REP trade union, the Electronic and Radio Workers Union in Belarus, which are right on the front line of struggle, because that's a militarized society, Putin, in alliance with Putin, to invade and to destroy Ukraine. And they are fighting against that. Of course, they can't fight openly and publicly without, committing suicide. But they are fighting in all kinds of clandestine ways, and the state is taking action. We have circulated information about this on our website, more on the Facebook, but we do ask the comrades to try and take it up in the trade unions and elsewhere. Those comrades must survive. They must build again and bring the light of socialist ideas and Marxist practice into the trade union movement in opposition to autocracy and to capitalism, because basically in Belarus it's dominated by the law of value. And we give full solidarity to those comrades. So please keep that in mind. Without knowing that we have comrades internationally who fight for us, certainly I would never have taken half the steps forward. And there's in Zimbabwe, and maybe that speaks also for other comrades in Namibia and in Belarus and elsewhere. Everywhere we're looking around to see who's with us, who's against us. And we are with those comrades who are fighting as revolutionaries under these conditions. Thank you.
Thank you, David. John, do you want to make some points about how the discussion went and some additional points of your own to try and draw some of the discussion together?
I'll just make a few points. First of all, to take up what Dominic and others said about democratic centre, I should have qualified my remarks for saying the so-called democratic centralism of these groups with their slave systems and self-perpetuating leadership. I think one thing that we have to understand, you know, it's been a great discussion, wide-ranging. I'm not agreed with some of the points, but I think what we have to face up when we look at the challenges we face as a Marxist left is to look, you know, at the state of the movement, because there's been a sort of 30-year plus hiatus in the class struggle worldwide. That gap has been filled by, you know, a sort of middle class liberal left, you know, more intent on fighting culture wars than class wars, and for them it's the isms that matter, that and they dominate the movement, and there's nothing more apparent to prove that than in the US. You've got the Alabama coal miners who've been on strike now for over a year, and you know, the sort of progressive left, you know, has refused to support them because the coal miners, because, you know, they're not to be touched, and things like that. And I think to add to, you know, to this problem with that liberal left is, you know, the working class as it is are too busy holding body and soul together. You know, you walk around the streets and people look worn out. You know, they're not going to rise up instantly because somebody says so, because they're too busy. They might, you know, they're working every hour God sends. They're working 2-3 jobs to hold, you know, the families, to feed the kids, etc., etc. And so I think these are the challenges that we have to discuss, and rather than look them in abstract, we have to, you know, take them on and really look at what and project what our answers are, and ultimately, you know, we believe in the class struggle. We believe that's the only way forward, but accepting the limitations of that at the moment. But I'll finish on this. We always have to offer hope. You know, I've been very fortunate. I always say this on every platform I speak at. I've been very fortunate in my life. A lot of people go through life, a life of drudgery and struggle and sacrifice, and never ever have a glimpse of hope. You know, I've been lucky. I've seen it twice. In our strike that took on the nearest thing to an insurrection in places that could have transformed Britain. And also we saw it to a different degree to the Corbyn movement in Britain that could have turned into a real movement, and had it not degenerated into people just singing, oh, Jeremy Corbyn, and thinking that was that, in Corbyn not actually mobilising that force. But, you know, if we learn the lessons of this, and as I say, our message always has to be optimism, that, you know, it's not doom and gloom, it's not certain drudgery. We offer a different world, a better world, where people work shorter hours, have a decent standard of living, can take their families on holidays and enjoy all the benefits that this world can provide. And that has to be our central message, I think.
Thank you, John. I'd like to thank John again for very stimulating opening contribution, which raised a lot of issues which comrades responded very well to. The discussion has been wide-ranging. You can see that John's invaluable experience has been brought to bear on the points that have been raised. Other comrades, again with immense experience in the movement, have brought that experience to bear on the discussion. So it's been a very useful discussion, and the contributions are all welcome. I think that point that John raised at the end is worth focusing on, this issue of hope. You can spend your whole life giving out about how bad things are, which is what you're up against, but there has to be hope. If there's no hope, what's the point of it all? If there isn't any kind of future that you can feel positive and stimulated about. Why are we giving out about everything? I think it's a very good aspect to highlight. So as well as being clear about the issues, as well as being clear about the policies that are needed, we must also be hopeful of a better future and raise the possibility, or the probability for that matter, of a new future where people are going to be happy and fulfilled in all aspects of their life. So it's a good point, I think, to end up on, John. Now, Roger, do you want to make some points about the meeting next week?
Well, next week we've got a report from comrades in Sri Lanka. I don't know if comrades are aware, but there's an absolute nightmare situation there. The country has run out of foreign exchange. There is shortages of food. There is shortages of oil. There is shortages of money, and the power cuts of 12 hours a day and so on. So I'm assuming and hoping that the comrades in Sri Lanka will have the means to be able to link up next week, but they are going to give a report. Okay.
Thank you, Roger. So with that, we'll draw this meeting to a conclusion. It's been a successful meeting. Thanks to all the comrades again. So we'll see you next week. Okay. Sloan.